I'm so excited to talk to you about Web UI because this is a space that has changed so much in the past 2 years, and there's so much good stuff coming to the platform. So you picked the right talk to go to. As you heard, my name is Yuna. I work as a developer relations engineer at Google Chrome, where I get to focus on CSS, UI, and dev tools. So I think that I'm decently qualified to give this talk talking about what's new in the web platform. So when I was preparing for this, there was just so much to cover that I couldn't possibly cover everything. And today I'm going to go over just a few things that have the biggest support across browser or the most impact. There are things missing from this list, like scroll-linked animations, which I won't have a time to talk to, Houdini, there's other things. But today I'll be talking about cascade layers, accent color, subgrid, the has family selector, container queries, and I'll talk about some APIs coming out of OpenUI, like the select menu, pop-up, and anchor positioning. So there's just so much. Let's get right into it. Now, I usually don't use GIFs in talks that much anymore, but truly, this is how I feel about all of the things that are landing in browsers right now, and all of these APIs that we've asked for years that we're now finally getting in browsers and implemented. So let's start with cascade layers. Cascade layers, who has heard of this API? Raise your hands. I can see, okay, we've got a couple of hands raised. So this is actually a pretty game-changing API because it allows a new entry point for the CSS cascade, which means that you, as a developer, now have better access to controlling your CSS architecture. So this is supported across all modern browsers as of earlier in this year, which is pretty exciting to see all of them sort of rolling out at the same time. And let me take you back to a time before we had cascade layers. So this is how the CSS cascade works. We have different entry points. So we have user agent styles, which is like Safari or Chrome or WebKit's styles that they send you, or Firefox style they send you from the user agent. So the browser has to look like something. There's base form controls. There's base styles. Then there's author styles. So that's what you and me write as developers, that you all see when you look at websites. And there's local user styles, which could be accessibility overrides or any customization the user wants to add. So when we look at the cascade, there's different layers of precedence. We have the base user agent styles, then we have the base local user styles, and then we see the styles that you all write on top of those, which are the base author styles. But if you use important on a tag or on some style rule, then that's going to actually invert the cascade. If you're using important, you might not know this, but this is how it actually works, where it's going to invert how the cascade works, and therefore important tags by you, the authors, have more precedence, a higher level of precedence than the base layers. Then the local user important will have more precedence than that, and the highest level of precedence is important styles from the user agent. Okay, we all cool here? So now with cascade layers, we have more injection points into the cascade. You can add layers. Unlayered styles, which is how we write CSS today, are going to have a higher level of precedence than layered styles. So when we look at how it all looks together here, let's just look at the site author layers. So that's the section in the middle in pink. So layered styles are going to have the least precedence, then your unlayered styles, but if you add important, it flips that. So then you have your important user styles, and then your important layered styles. And you can extend this to the rest of the cascade, where at the lowest level of precedence will be layered user agent styles, and then we go from there. So that's pretty cool because now we can set up our layers at the top of our main CSS file like this, where we set up the layer where we have base, typography, and utilities. And because layered styles have less precedence than your normal styles, you can use this as a progressive enhancement. So what that might look like is this. We've set up our layers, or you can write them right in your CSS. And here we have a couple of links that I'm styling with different colors. Now, the base links are red. Obviously, you've seen a red here. Then we have a link with a class of link that you can see here, but that's blue, that's also being ignored. And the reason why is because in the next layer of typography, all the base links are being styled with the color of green. And because the layer has greater precedence, even though the specificity of the class is higher than the base tag, it's going to take precedence and apply that style to all the links because it's in a layer typography. So with great power comes great responsibility. And then finally, we have a layer called utilities with a pink class, and you see the pink link there. You can see these as well in DevTools. So here, if you inspect DevTools in Chrome, you could see all of your layers, why certain styles are getting ignored. And if we remember the Cascade, this is why, because this is how it now works with Cascade layers, great for progressively enhancing third-party code and working with large code bases that you need to organize. So you can establish your layers up front. You can also import layers directly into style sheets. So I could directly import a reset style. I could directly import third-party code. You can also nest layers. So you can nest layers like components.header. You could have components.footer, components.sidebar, which is nice for organization. And unlayered styles will win on top of layered styles unless there is that important tag. All right, I know that was a lot, but that was just one of 6, so let's keep going. Next, we have accent color, and this is a bit of a shorter one because it's literally one line of code to give your page a base theme color, which is great because sometimes styling form controls is a pain in the ass. And this is something that is also supported across browsers. As of Safari 15.4, it is now something you can all use this year, and it is, as I mentioned, one line of code to colorize native form controls. And that looks like this. Accent color is the property, and then you change the color that you want to see. So it could be yellow or green. And this will propagate to all the form controls what the checkboxes look like. And the cool thing is that this also works with the color scheme properties, so native browser color scheme. Here's a demo on accentcolor.glitch.me, built by one of our engineers, where you can see what this would look like on a light and a dark color scheme. It's automatically done for you in the browser, so just a nice little progressive enhancement, if you will, for form controls if you're using native form controls. So now let's talk about subgrid. Subgrid is really great, and it's something that I wish that we already had in browsers. It is something that allows you to create grid systems that leverage the logic of their parent grid systems. Who in this room uses CSS Grid in your work? So that should be pretty much all of you, or most of you. A lot of people use Flexbox as well. Grid is just super powerful, and when it's combined with subgrid, that's where we really are seeing these robust layouts becoming a lot more easy for us to think through and to build. So subgrid is supported in Firefox 71. It's been out in Firefox for a while. Safari just announced a release of Safari 16 last week, where it's supported there, and it's a work in progress in Chromium. So with subgrid, what we can do is first we can create a grid on the body. So here we have grid template columns. We're naming our grids. So if you're not used to the named grid areas, that's what this looks like, where we're saying we want to start at full bleed start, then we want to go to main start, then we want to go to main end, and then we want to go to full bleed end. So that might look like this. This is an example from Adam Argyle where it goes all the way left to right, and you see the content in this main section, and this image going full bleed all the way across the grid. So once we've set up the body grid, we can then set up all of the elements inside of the body to align to the body's grid. And we're doing grid template columns subgrid. After that, we can then use those template columns. We can set main content to the grid column of main. We could set the hero image to the grid column of full bleed, and now we're placing these sections within the subgrid within the page. So that looks like this, and in Firefox there are dev tools that you can inspect and see where we have a grid and where we have subgrid elements aligned to the grid. There's a great article also by Ahmad Shadid, which covers subgrid, and this is one of the images from it, which shows you that you can have these different sections, and then within the sections you can have subgrid lines of, say, a featured section, and then align your content to the parent's grid while it all makes this cohesive UI. And I think that this makes even more sense when we look at this example, where we have this 6x column layout on the parent, and then within that we have the section with text on the left or some kind of copy, and then an image gallery on the right, but that image gallery is leveraging grid columns from its parent. So this just really lets you align things very nicely in a way that we can't currently do when you have to create new grids on top of grids each time. So now let's talk about one of my absolute favorites. That is the has selector. Has anyone here heard of has? Okay, I feel like the people who raised their hand raised them up because this is a great one. So this one, I feel like it really is game-changing. It allows for you to select parent elements based on their children, and not just parent elements, but also any element that lives inside of that parent. So it's super powerful. And that one is currently available in Chromium 105, Safari 15.4, and it is a work in progress in Firefox, but there is a post-CSS polyfill called CSS has sudo. This one is super easy to use because it is a pseudo class that you just use by using has and then putting an element inside. So for this example, it's figure has fig caption. And what we're doing is we're selecting a figure that has a fig caption, but only figures that have fig captions. So you might have an image that doesn't have a caption. So what we're doing here is then we're giving a border bottom and a border right, and we're styling it so that the fig caption, that text, just aligns more with the image and is separated from the rest of the text on the page a little bit more. Here's another example. I will share all of these links also after my talk on Twitter, so you can find them there, where you can actually go in and edit and play around with them. So here's another example where I have a border around an image with a fig caption, again, just separating that from the rest of the text and creating some visual division on the page. There's so many great examples. Here's another one. This one is looking for if a form control has an invalid state within a form group, set an error message to display block. So visually show an error message, where you might have some code that looks like this, where you have a form group, you have a name and email, where an email could use form invalidation, and you could have an error message that is display none, so it wouldn't appear to screen readers, and it wouldn't appear visually to users. But if you had an invalid state, you can write this in CSS in one line of code for that selector, where you then would display it when you have an invalid pseudo state. So you can do this without JavaScript. The best JavaScript is no JavaScript. I quote Ben Lesh, he said that. Yes. So you can take this a step further and then only do this if that form control is not focused. So you can then say form group has an invalid state, not focused. You can combine it with the not pseudo selector, which is in a part of the same spec. And now you're really writing robust code so that this will only show up if I'm not actively typing. So here I'm still typing, and then the minute I stop typing, that's when it'll say, oh, you have an invalid entry, this email is invalid. So pretty handy, pretty cool, pretty quick to write. This example comes from Jay Tompkins. As I mentioned, it is going to be linked with an article all about the has selector on developer.chrome.com, which I encourage you all to check out after this talk. Not during. So that's it in action. Another great example is using has on the root. And you can use has on the root for a couple of things. One example is dark and light modes, where you could set the dark and light theme based on using has and selection. Another one is that menu example. So you can check if aria expanded equals true in the navigation. So you could have on the root, does something in the root have aria expanded equals true? In this case, I'm looking to see if a nav in the root has aria expanded equals true. And what I'm doing is I'm setting the variable to 1. Now, when I'm calling that variable in the body, I have a transform that's going to translate the body negative 200 pixels with 0 as the default value. Or if there is the aria expanded equals true, then it's 1. So we're multiplying 1 by negative 200 px, and we're moving it negative 200 pixels using that transform if aria expanded equals true. So that is just another way to kind of use has on the root and do some really seemingly complex things in just a couple of lines of CSS without having to rely on adding additional scripting and dependencies. Now, quantity queries are one of my favorite uses of has. This is an example of something that I had to build when I was working at Bustle, which is a publication, a women's media publication, where at the end of our articles, sometimes we'll have big photo shoots. There'll be a lot of credits, hair, makeup, photography 1, set design. So what they wanted was a list of all of these credits, but if the list got too long, they didn't want like 12 people listed vertically. They wanted it to be inline and with a semicolon sort of dividing each of these names. So in order to do this, this is just a regular list in HTML. But in CSS, what I'm doing is I'm looking to see if that unordered list has an nth child of n plus 5. If it gets to that state of over 5 items, then I'm going to move from the block view into that inline view. That's the first thing I'm going to do. So I'm going to show all these list items in line next to each other. And then I'm going to add a semicolon to each of the list items unless it's the last list item. So I can write UL has nth child n plus 5, and then on the list item that I'm styling, I can say not last child, and then after is where I'm actually styling on the pseudo element. So adding content there to sort of separate it. I don't know. I think it's pretty cool. I think has is cool. So the future of responsive design really does lie in our ability to use these selectors and to combine them. This ability to create encapsulated responsive components, it goes really well hand in hand with how we build today using frameworks when you have components that you can use all over the page. And something like this allows us to write logical styles that live with the components themselves. So let's say we have a card component. This is just a really common demo where you have a card, say you have some visual in there, say you have some text, so a div class with meta, and then inside of that we have a title and some text content. So that might look like this. We have our card, we have our visual image, we have our title, we have our text. This is a card with a single column layout. So if it has display grid, then I could set grid template columns to 1FR. So this is what it would look like if it didn't have an image, which still looks good. It has a title, it has some text, it doesn't look funky, it makes sense. But now what happens when we want to, at wider sizes, set our cards to 2 columns? Instead of a 1-column grid, we want it to be 2-column grid. Now we could set grid template columns to 1FR, 1FR, if it has an image. So it would look like this, where now we have a 2-column layout. If we didn't use has for this, and we just set this to grid template columns 1FR, 1FR on that card without the image, it would look weird because now we're fitting the entire meta text into only one of the columns and nothing is on the right-hand side and it looks empty. We want it to look like that. And that's why we would use has to check if there was an image. Then we would only apply it if it had that visual there and it would be 2 columns. Otherwise, it'd be 1 column. So you can take this even further, and you can use not with has, one of my favorite combos, and you could write card not has image and increase the font size so that the cards without a visual image would have some more presence and take up more space on the page and not be so small. And so that way we can get something like this. And then when you put it all together, you have all of these variations just by using a couple of lines of code and have this component own all this logical information. If it has an image inside of it, what to do, how to apply it. So that's just the start. This is just the beginning of writing responsive component-based UIs. The next step really comes to container queries. Container queries enable component-based responsive UI where elements own their intrinsic styling information. Has let us start to get there, but container queries really take us over the edge. And here's what I'm actually really curious of who has heard about container queries. Okay. Man, I was hoping it was more of you, but after this talk, you're all going to be believers. Believers in container queries. So with container queries, we currently have support in 2 browsers. As of last week with Safari 16, it's also supported in Chromium 105. This is support for inline size-based container queries and container query units. The spec itself is actually much more broad than that, which is inclusive of style container queries and state queries, but those are going to be further down the line. And there's also a polyfill that works in older browsers, and that is by Google Chrome Labs at Container Query Polyfill. You can find that on GitHub as well. With container queries, we have access to look into the size information of where that element lives on the page. So instead of something like media queries where we just have the global viewport styling information, like we can look at the viewport, but that doesn't really make sense if we want to size these cards individually. That doesn't really make sense when we're looking at reusable components that can live anywhere in a UI, whether it's the sidebar or a different page or a hero section or the footer. So we need something that is more narrow. We don't want this blunt hammer. We need more fine-tuned tools here. And that's what container queries do. This is the same card component that is on the same page, but it's in a grid where there's different sized grid elements. And so on the exact same page, we don't have to worry about the wider UI or classes to adjust these styles. We can write once and have these components be resilient. So when we are talking about this card element, it would make much more sense to use a container query instead of a media query. Because if we use a container query, then all of these variations can exist on the same page. They don't have to exist with additional classes, with additional styling that you have to then manage as a development team. You just write once, you test your individual components, and they make sense no matter where you put them. here's an example of just that. So here's a plant website where I'm using container queries to apply styles to all of these little elements. So in that hero section, in that sidebar, in that product grid, this is all the same component. It's reusable. You can include it, apply your content, and just especially with container-based frameworks and how people write JavaScript today, this makes so much more sense as a function of how we write code. And here's another example of a calendar. If you look at the text is shrinking when those lines of the calendar get a little bit more narrow, and the date on top is also going from this wide column grid to a stacked view where I'm changing the font size and the font width of that layout. So that text is getting bigger, and then as this gets even wider, that will again stack to be wide. And so you can start to stack these individual elements within your UIs. Here's another example from David Heron from Oddbird, where what I really like about this example is it is a pull quote. And even on the web, we see pull quotes within text sort of full screen or on the side with text flowing to the side of them. And here's an example of where you don't need to change the page size to see the benefit and the effect of container queries. It's a really clever way to kind of customize that UI, and no matter how much space you give that pull quote, it looks good and it looks unique and it makes sense for the spaces provided. You can take this step further and then start to add on to container queries. So here is a responsive button element. So here I created an SVG where I wanted this buttons, that little card, to go from a shopping cart, then add some more detail, then add the plus, then add the text that just says add, and then add to cart. And I created an SVG where this is going to be progressively included as the space is increasing for that card. So now I'm creating a container query card with a container query button, and I'm using container query names to then pull from where I am naming things. And this is where things really start to stack, and you can see how this card is just able to contain so much intrinsic styling logic and information. And whew, it's so cool that we can now do this in web UIs. Containers in containers. There's a great site called it's Ahmad Hadid's Lab, and it has a bunch of other examples like a timeline component. I really like the newsletter example. So if you're interested in learning more or playing with container queries, I'd recommend this. That has a bunch of different components to kind of explore and see how they work. And finally, the future is so bright with OpenUI. This is definitely a lot more experimental than the other things I've talked about in this talk. And some of these APIs, all of them really need to go through the standards finalization process. But I wanted to give you a heads up on how web developers are thinking about solving some of the biggest frustrations in web UI. And so that is a group called OpenUI. You can follow along on GitHub or on openui.org. All the issues are open source, and you can check them out and also give your voice into this, because we definitely want your voice as a developer who's day-to-day working on this stuff. This is a tweet from 2017, almost exactly a year ago. It's 2017, why can we still not style dropdowns? And I feel this in my bones. I still feel it in my bones. But that's where we have select menu. So there is a Canary experiment. A Chromium experiment. You could turn on experimental web platform features. If you want to play with this, it's not currently available in other browsers. And this is the frustration, is that you can style form controls, but you can't even create something like this, which is just a flag next to a country and a dropdown. Like, why can we still not do this natively? Why do we have to hack it every single time, rebuild the accessibility? Makes no sense. So with select menu, you can do that. It lets you create a select menu, a new native element which has accessibility built in. It lets you set a slot for the selected value and a slot for the list box of options that are going to be selectable for this component. And so here's just like a silly rainbow color select menu that I quickly created as a demo for this talk, where I have just these colors and these figures that have just a color value to be more representative. And now this is something that we can start to build with select menu. There's even more demos on this website from Patrick Brossett of Microsoft Edge, where he creates an emoji picker, a drop-down with a title and some sub-content, a multi-select, a searchable menu. So this is just everywhere in our UIs, and now with the select menu API, we should be able to build these a little bit more easily without having to recreate the web every single time. And that brings me to the pop-up attribute. So with select menu, you have a list box that pops up into the top layer, and it has certain behaviors like light dismiss and others. And this is something that we definitely see all over the web and all different types of ways that we use pop-ups. It's not just select menus, it's also for things like tooltips, whether that's a dialogue tooltip that's interactive or something that's just informative. We see it in menus, so a page level menu could be a pop-up. It might pop up above the rest of the page, and you maybe want to blur the rest of the page. And we see it in toasts and hints, which are temporary pieces of information that you get sometimes at the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen, like little banners. So if we want to create a pop-up now with a pop-up API, which you can play with experimental web platform features turned on, we would just create a pop-up with an ID and with a pop-up attribute. And again, I don't have too much time to go too deep into this, but this is the basic way to do it. And then we set a pop-up toggle target from a button onto the ID of the pop-up. So when we click on that button, it's just gonna pop up, and we have a pop-up. And this will already have a lot of great features like light dismiss and things that you don't have to implement over and over again. You can add close buttons, you could do whatever you want, you can add whatever content you want in here. So this is what that might look like. There's a great article on developer.chrome.com about pop-ups and how to use them with a bunch of demos. So that's one use case. The other cool thing is you can stack pop-ups. So you can add pop-ups on top of each other, all within the top layer. You can remove pop-ups. You have that capability of light dismissing them. They're really powerful. And that leads me to the last API that I'm going to talk about today, which is anchor positioning, because anchor positioning is truly needed for pop-ups. As you scroll around the page, you don't want that pop-up to stay there. You want it to move with wherever you're moving the page to, with the element that is anchoring it. And this is not just for pop-ups, it's for a lot of different APIs. But here's one example of where this becomes a problem. This is Waze.com. And we have this page that disables overscroll because it's a panable map. But now when we click open this drop-down menu, you can't scroll to get to the last option if it's too narrow. So we need something like an anchoring API that can actually move this around the page and continue to make it visible. And this is another example on Tooling Report, which is a tooltip that I built with my team, where we had to add a bunch of logic in JavaScript just to make sure that it stayed on the page when we clicked on that element. So this is where the CSS anchoring API comes in. It lets you attach elements to each other and anchor them together. And it also lets you set a position set. So you can create a fallback value for the position and the positions of where you're placing them. I'm going to pretend they're clapping for this API, which is so cool. So you can set this all up and have the browser actually determine what this looks like. So you don't have to do all of the calculations yourself in JavaScript. You have it in CSS. Woo! But you can use it beyond pop-ups too. It's not just for pop-up elements. You can use it with other elements in your UI. So in this example, we have a bar chart where we have the min and max value labels moving along with the rest of the elements. So as you adjust the height of this bar chart, you can change the placement because they're anchored to the minimum and maximum values in that bar chart. So it's really handy, not just for pop-ups, but for all sorts of interfaces on the platform. So now, I promised I'm almost done. We are in a golden era for WebUI. And I feel like there's just so much that's landing. There are so many APIs that fundamentally change how we write code and how we build responsive interfaces that it's hard to ignore this moment. So I think it's a really exciting time to be a front-end developer and to get an opportunity to do this kind of work. Somebody was asking me earlier today, like, you know, what was it like in the past? I mean, we had to clear fix all of our floats. We don't have to do that anymore. I'm going to pretend that was... all right, I'll take it. I mean, you're honestly clap for all the browser developers because they're the ones who are making this possible, and we're just trying to make your voices heard so that they can continue this good work. So on that note, I know that it feels like there's a lot changing, but my team's job is to make sure that you're on top of it and to make sure that we're working on the right things. So you can definitely follow along. Here's where you can find me and some of the work that our team is where we're writing. So you can find me on Twitter, and I'm going to share links after this talk at Una. Also, I host a podcast called the CSS Podcast, where we cover these topics and more. My writing is also on una.im and web.dev and developer.chrome.com, and follow along on Chromium Dev just to learn more and kind of track where things are going in the platform. All right, that's all I have for you today, so thank you.